Hey everyone, happy Monday. Hope it was a good weekend for you. Looking at the opening bell coming up in just about a minute here. So I want to join you all, talk about what I'm seeing as we get ready for another exciting trading week here. Of course, you're welcome to ask any questions if you have any in the chat room. We'll go over some of the news. We do see inflation coming back to China, which overall is a good sign for the beleaguered economy, but it could put some pressures on the idea of easing further from here. Japan seems to have pulled itself out of a technical recession, not having two negative quarters in a row, clearing the path to move from NERP to ZERP. This is putting some pressure on the Nikkei, and it could also have an impact on other equities around the world, as we know excess liquidity from the Bank of Japan was coming into other markets as well. Opening bell coming up just in a few moments here. And as we get ready for this trading day, it is important to remember there are some events happening. We do have triple witching this week, so we have futures expiring, we have options expiring. That is likely to add to some of the volatility. As we get into today, we do see skew came down last week a little bit, so that might suppress those supportive Vanna and charm flows that we typically see first hour. Nevertheless, they should be there to some degree, and that may be some of what we're seeing anticipatory flows pre-market here as well. And we just hit the opening bell here. And just give me 1 second. I see one stream is not on. I'll be right back. Definitely seeing a little bit of a pop here at the open as well. We'll zoom out just a little bit here. And we have rolled over to the June contract, so that is what we're seeing on screen here for the S&P 500. I've rolled over the SPX options visualizer as well, so all that data is now looking towards June. And we are seeing some potential area of support around this wall of puts that we have mapped out from last week, but we are seeing pressure increasing here. These larger red bubbles, what you're seeing there is more selling aggression. These are driven by delta, or the difference between buyers and sellers as they're crossing. We could see as we got that pop, sellers began to get much more aggressive here. So a bit of a battle at the open here between buyers and sellers. Sellers overall seeming to start to take control here. I do like to look at the 20-minute opening range to get a better idea. So we're not quite there yet, obviously. We've got another 16 minutes. But so far, looking like buyers made an attempt. And we're going to zoom in on this microstructure here just to show it a little bit better. They made that attempt to push things higher. Sellers dragging that price lower below the point of control in VWAP. And we do see that selling pressure continuing. That microstructure now starting to look a little bit like a downtrend, lower highs and lower lows here post-open. Let's check in on the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ also a similar look. We're going to zoom in a little bit. Seeing a little bit of stabilization so far, but a pull right at the open as well in the NASDAQ. Take a look at the Russell. Russell's got the opposite look. This is a theme we've been discussing for some time, and it's that the Russell's moving the opposite of the NASDAQ. It has everything to do with hedge fund positioning, whereas hedge funds are very long NASDAQ stocks. They're quite short the Russell, the whole index. And so when you have the NASDAQ down, the Russell tends to lead higher because you have hedge funds starting to degross or deleverage, covering their shorts, exiting their longs. So that's one of the reasons I think we see that dichotomy here. You've got gold, strong bid here, just took out a large level of resting liquidity on the offer above around 21.88. And gold has really been rocketing higher after making new all-time highs. Silver and gold miners, the higher quality ones at least, seem poised to follow there. And oil slipping now just narrowly above 77 with some large resting liquidity down here at 76.80. We've got the 2-year note contract not doing too much this morning. I suspect it'll be doing a lot more tomorrow around CPI. And we also have the 10s here. We'll be checking back on those in a little bit. But for now, let's look at the euro. Getting a little bit of a bid here post-cash open. So that's showing you just a little bit of weakness in the dollar. Similar story with the yen, although overall the yen has struggled a bit. And let's look at NVIDIA. NVIDIA having quite an interesting day. That big pull at the open that we saw across the other broader indices. Also, we saw that same with NVIDIA, but it's now bouncing just about $18 off those lows, just up to the point of control, where there is a large area in that
ticker
session volume
FOUR,
profile.
Foxtrot Oscar Uniform Romeo. So sure seeing an increase in activity. No circulation attempts, unconfirmed. Company has canceled their appearance at the Wolf Conference.
So we do have some interesting news, the high beta stocks that we're going to have as we navigate the trading day here, adding that in from Benzinga. So that's another bit of live squawk news we're adding in. Let's go around here, check out SMCI. SMCI also had a pretty big pull at the open, falling about 4%, 4.5%, now starting to rebound. Meta, similar look, had that big pull at the open, now starting to rebound a bit here. Amazon looking a bit stronger than Meta, but similar look, really just coming through some of those areas of resting bids below, finally finding support around 172.50 and bouncing from there. Microsoft, a similar look, finding that support around 402, where there was a very large level of resting liquidity when it found that level and actually came through and filled that bid. Apple actually looking comparatively stronger than the rest of the pack, which is an interesting change of pace as Apple has been a laggard. And Google actually also looking pretty strong. So both Google and Apple were laggards. Let's take a look at Tesla as well. And boy, it's kind of all over the map here, but it actually looks comparatively stronger than some of its peers as well. So an interesting dichotomy today. We'll also just take a quick look at the overall semiconductor ETF. If you didn't know, 25% of it is NVIDIA, 10% of it is Taiwan Semiconductor. So it's kind of the NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor ETF, but we love it just the same. It's a great way to gauge risk appetite in a market that's very much led by semis. And we do see call skew blown out pretty significantly for NVIDIA and SMH, just showing that options buyers are not concerned about downside. They're concerned about missing upside. So we'll circle back here to the S&P. Got a bit of a pop as those other stocks, those leadership stocks recovered, but now we're seeing a draw again. Right back to this VWAP POC put wall convergence area that may act as support. Do see some big flows coming in for NVIDIA options here.
The EU Economy Commissioner Gentiloni says the EU is starting the year with a very weak economic activity.
Looks like someone paid about 1.25 million for 950 NVIDIA calls expiring May 17th, just came over. And then another 1.1 million for that same expiration date on 950. So a lot of NVIDIA sweeps coming through this morning on the call side. Another large one, Mara, $30 calls for June 21st. 750,000 in premium paid there. AMD looking like 265s for this Friday. I'm sorry, 205s for this Friday. And he got 677,000 in premium paid there. And then 315,000 just paid for Tesla 180s for this Friday. So just a lot of call activity coming through. Unusually large call activity this morning. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ here. It is recovering, I would say, comparatively better than the S&P overall. NASDAQ and S&P down 0.2% so far on their cash indexes. But you can see that bit of that difference there. Let's just zoom them both out a little bit. You can see how the NASDAQ looks a bit comparatively better than the S&P overall. NASDAQ above its point of control and VWAP and just sort of bouncing off that point of control here. S&P, similar look but lower. Not really the same vigor behind the buying. And that probably has to do with most of the excitement happening in tech so far this morning.
Oil futures extend losses. The US crude down by $1 a barrel.
We do see that pressure extending to energy stocks. XLE down just over 0.5% here. And just quite choppy trade so far this morning. We're going to go around here. We see the NASDAQ starting to pull again, pulling below the point of control in VWAP. S&P just testing those same levels. Let's take a look at some of the more important NASDAQ stocks here. Of course, we'll start with NVIDIA. NVIDIA is pretty much recovered. That was a bit of a round trip this morning. Looks like sellers got a bit exhausted around that 844 level. Then we saw this rebid up almost $30 from that low. And now we're just starting to see that settle. We're not seeing a ton of volume in shares so far this morning in NVIDIA. SMCI has yet to recover from its lows, seems to be more basing. Meta, similar look with that stock, really not showing anything more than a series of lower highs and lower lows. So microstructure downtrend here.
EU's
Amazon
Gentiloni
looks
says we have perspective of economic acceleration in the second half.
Amazon looks comparatively constructive here. Microsoft similar but a little bit less energetic. Apple so far looks great today overall compared to its peers on that recovery post cash open. And so does Google. And Tesla overall looks comparatively better than its peers as well, really starting to build momentum going up into that 180 level, where there's a really large amount of resting liquidity above, about 114,000 shares on offer here, as we really just a couple cents away from that level. So it'd be important to see how it reacts there, whether it's able to push through or gets rejected. And seeing the S&P kind of struggle here with that point of control VWAP put wall convergence level. Looks like that's going to be kind of our daily pivot so far. Just that convergence of those three key levels does give us a pretty good line in the sand between buyers and sellers having control. Let's zoom out a little bit, see if there's any large unusual levels of resting liquidity. Not so much. Pretty routine order book. Not super deep order book. Take a look at a couple things here. Just give me a sec. All right. Let's take a look at the news, see what is percolating here. NVIDIA's CEO Jensen Huang says, even free AI chips from rivals are not cheap enough compared to its GPUs, which is kind of interesting commentary. AMD has an MI300X AI accelerator that is about a third of the price of the H100 and is quite a bit better in terms of its performance and also has more memory. So I'm not really sure what he's saying there. Maybe they're talking more about the lock-in to the CUDA ecosystem that NVIDIA provides, but in terms of the chips and their technological superiority, dollar per dollar, that's just no longer a thing. It has much more to do with the lock-in effect. People, have developed a lot of code for NVIDIA hardware via CUDA, so they're less likely to break away from that. Let's take a look at the Russell here. Russell's just giving it up now. So we had that pop at the open when
We're
the
shortly
rest of the
expecting
market
the Bank of
dropped.
England gilt sale results.
And then we really gave that up as we saw comparatively the NASDAQ run. So it was, again, that inverse picture. NASDAQ up, Russell down. That seems to be kind of a bit of a theme, and it has a lot to do with hedge fund leverage. They are very, very long NASDAQ stocks. They are very short the Russell. And so when you see days when the NASDAQ is down, typically the Russell is going to get a bid as they cover those shorts and vice versa. Crude really did slip below that 70 level, filled in that rather large area of resting liquidity on the bid. And we see larger bids now building below 76.60, 76.50, and then 76, really a huge level of resting liquidity there for this contract as well. Take a look at the euro. Wow, look at that little slip that we just saw there. That's pretty interesting. And that's just showing there's a bit of strength coming back to the dollar. Let's see what's going on in rates. Not anything quite as major, but seeing a bit of a slip in the 10-year note futures as well. Take a quick look at the yen, also slipping against the dollar here. So typically that's not great for equities, and we are seeing a continuation of that pull now. So we're just going to kind of keep the amount of time we have from the opening to the present on screen for right now till we get to about a half hour, but we're just about to form that 20-minute opening range, so that's why I really want to have a better look-see. On the S&P, we're cracking that lower end of the 15-minute range, but still forming the 20-minute opening range here. Options activity pretty balanced. If we're looking at the SPX options visualizer, we see the midpoint coming in. You see a pretty large dispersion between the opinions of where the most active call strike is, which also happens to align with a large level of resting offer, and that most active put strike, right? So you see opinions across the board about where SPX could go. But it is early yet, so we'll keep an eye on those as the day goes on. And that's part of the SPX options visualizer that I've written for Bookmap, the program we're running here to show the charts. Seeing some unusual options activity in SMCI. Someone paid about $320,000 for the 1250 calls expiring this Friday. Other semis also seeing some unusual activity. Intel 46 strike for April 19th, $259,000 in premium paid for those calls. Petrobras, $16 call strike, July 19th, $116,000 paid for that one. MicroStrategy, 2000 strike, April 19th, $192,000 premium paid for that. It's just all over the call side today, the amount of options activity that is unusual, that qualifies for my scan. It's all on the call side. There's some puts, obviously, but it's a fraction of what we're seeing on the call side after the open here. So I'll continue to check in on that as we go throughout the day. We'll go back to the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ now seeing a bit of a pull like the S&P below the point of control and VWAP level here. We do see cumulative volume delta moving deeper into the negative, about 1,400 net sold contracts over the last 30-minute period. S&P here, we're going to take a quick look. We're going to go right back to the
Brent
open.
crude oil falls $1 a barrel.
We are now piercing the bottom of the opening range on the S&P. And we are closing in on the gamma flip level, which, if we do move below it, does suggest that we'll start to see some more volatility as dealers sell dips and buy rips. We also have the volatility trigger right below there. If we do push below there, that does add to the idea that we'll probably see an increase in overall volatility given how much options positioning is at that vol trigger level. You can see these all visualized in the charts. If you go to the bot queries room, you can look at the SPX charts, both full chain and 0 DTE, to get a better idea of options activity as it's happening throughout the day. Another big chunk for NVIDIA, $390,000 premium paid for the 1,000 strike. And they're taking that out to, it looks like December 20th. And got a decent pull in corn and wheat today, both down over 1% as the weakness in ag continues. We do see soybean futures with record short positioning. And we see a continuation in that theme. So I would say we have pierced the bottom of the opening range. We're building acceptance into that move. So it does look like we've got some further room to the downside here. We will see if that vol trigger level provides us any support. It is such a large area of positioning on the SPX options chain that we could potentially see some support there. But so far, weakness does seem to be the name of the game. And we did see a bit of a bid in volatility overnight as well. Often is the case when you see that, and the VIX has a high to low difference of 5% overnight, to the upside, that tends to lead to a not so pleasant trading day the next day. Now, it's not 100%, and it's been less of a correlation from late 2023 to the present, but I saw that alert fire overnight last night, and indeed again today, we are seeing a bit of a pull. NASDAQ down about 0.6% here. S&P down about 0.4% on cash. Take a look at the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ really showing some weakness coming all the way through. Let's just pull this back to the open. And not quite piercing the bottom of the opening range for it yet, but pretty darn close, and I'm willing to say that we will likely get there. Russell now just following the trend of the other indices, just moving lower and lower here. Apparently even weakness in the NASDAQ now, not enough to give this thing a short covering bid. Gold rolling over a little bit, but just scratched up close to 21.92 on that recent high. And crude catching a bid now, but still most of that resting liquidity in crude is below us until we get all the way up to 79. Let's take a look at the 10s. Not so much to see. Euro continuing to roll over, stabilizing a little bit over the last few minutes, but that's suggesting dollar strength, which is typically bearish for equities. S&P companies, about 40% of their revenue comes overseas. So when that dollar strengthens, it actually hurts that revenue in the Forex translation. Yen also had a bit of a pull down here, a little bit more stable now. And NVIDIA giving up some of those gains after it made that high, sort of following the pattern in the NASDAQ. SMCI making new lows recently here. Meta, similar look, also making new lows recently. Amazon following along, not quite below the cash open low, but not terribly far away here as we see some weakness. Microsoft looking a bit comparatively strong, but still had a pullback from its highs. And Apple, big pullback, now bouncing off that level, trying to get up to that resting liquidity at 174 again.
Into NHR, Algeria's oil and gas 2023 export revenue was $50 billion.
And Google trying once again for 138 with all of its might. We do have a large resting bid coming in below, also around 136.75. So that's a bit of an area, two key areas, I should say, where there's interest in price. And Tesla really leaving the rest of the pack behind here. Very interesting to see this. Tesla cracking that 180 level and cracking 182. These are all levels with large resting offers above. 183 and 185 now on the horizon. We'll take a look at the semis. Semis just continue to have a microstructure downtrend look, lower highs, lower lows. So a bit of distribution happening there. We'll go back to the S&P. And so overall, just seeing that continuation of weakness as a theme here. We do see more put activity starting to populate, but again, the call side of things is still extremely buoyant. Someone bought MicroStrategy 2,900 strikes for June 21st, putting out 705,000 in premium. Incredible. cracking that vol trigger and gamma flip level here on ES. These are, again, S&P levels that are translated to ES using the advanced SPX options visualizer available in the Bookmap Marketplace. And so this does, as we grind below, I would say 5 to 7 points below and build acceptance, that does portend to additional downside and a potential increase in overall volatility. AMD options are getting hot again. Got the 205, so the 28 of this month. On the call side, 362,000 in premium paid there. Path, I believe their earnings are coming up this week. UiPath, $30 strike. They're looking out to January of next year, 295,000 in premium paid. We do see some NVIDIA puts coming through. They're targeting mostly the 860, 820, 850 strikes going out this Friday. About $500,000 in premium paid. More MicroStrategy calls coming through. 1,900 for April 19th, 102,000 in premium paid. They're just all about pumping that one today. And that stock's up 6.29% to 1515.22, slipping back from its highs of about 1550. S&P continuing to pull lower. We do see liquidity building to the downside on the bid. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ here. Similar look here. Just weakness all around in U.S. equities building as a theme, a continuation from Friday. And remember, one thing that is often the case is Friday to Monday continuation, right? So you see something start on a Friday, in this case a sell, it's not terribly unlikely that you get continuation into Monday. So the question then becomes, do we see turnaround Tuesday? And Reddit will be launching its long-awaited IPO. This coming in off of Bloomberg. I think they're hoping to raise at least $750 million off that IPO. That number keeps rising. We did cover that IPO in our a segment we did on Traderade called Thesis Thursday. Let's take a look at the Russell 2000. Oh, small caps grinding to new lows here. Really nasty action in the Russell. You had that initial pop, bit of short covering, and then just lower highs, lower lows, lower highs, lower lows. That is a pretty clear downtrend structure in the Russell here. Taking a look at gold. Gold pulling now. Had a nice open, but we are seeing it giving most of that back. Crude building off of its lows, but still a bit sluggish overall today. Down just over 1%. 10-year note futures pretty flat. Not a lot to see here. Probably won't be much to see here until we get the much anticipated CPI data tomorrow. And Euro stabilizing after that big pull. Let's take a look at some of these stocks. NVIDIA now giving back some of those gains. Let's just zoom back out a little bit here so we can get a sense. Yeah, so pretty much giving back that post-open pop that we got after the draw, right? So this is a stock where we're continuing to see enormous amounts of call buying and interest, but so far, at least for the purposes of today's trading session, not enough to offset some of the profit-taking and overall distributive pressure in the stock. SMCI now trading down quite a bit, now at 1032. When we got to the cash open this morning, it was trading just above 1100. So seeing this thing trade down now over 6%. Meta, also similar look, just grinding lower and lower. These are a lot of the AI stocks that we enjoyed that perpetual bid. And now they're all pulling back. Let's take a look at Amazon. Amazon, very similar look here. Really the whole Magnificent Four, what's left of the Magnificent Seven, not looking so hot today. Microsoft, probably the best of the bunch of that Mag 4. Now we'll look at some of the old leaders. Apple starting again to show some strength today after, really several weeks of just downside action after they abandoned their self-driving car. There's been problems with the Vision Pro and concerns about slowing global iPhone sales, particularly in China. Nevertheless, Apple targeting this 174 level where there is a large resting offer overhead. We've seen it try to crack that level. It did once earlier today, only to slip back. I'd say 174 is a pretty key level for Apple today. And Google just continuing to push higher. Really, Google and Tesla overall have shown the most strength of that pack. Tesla also continuing to push higher here. Overall, an impressive move for the company after it's had such a difficult time. And it did crack that 177.77 pivot level, which is really an important area. And that, longs are appropriate for people trying to sort of tick bottoms and look for reversals above that level. So indeed, we are seeing that continue today. And SMH, following the rest of the pack, just kind of grinding towards new lows. You are seeing some more SMCI calls coming in now. Lower strikes, 1040s and 1070s for this Friday. About 415,000 in premium paid. Also seeing some interesting Google 140s for next Friday on the call side. 123,000 in premium paid there. And Tesla 210s. Looking at that going out to May. And NVIDIA 950 is crossing at 140 premium paid for this Friday. So just continued interest in that stock, but the options buying so far not able to overwhelm the distributive pressure that we're seeing today. Seeing new lows come in on the S&P here. Just continuing that grind lower after he broke the bottom of the 20-minute opening range and broke below the gamma flip level and vol trigger, and now getting closer and closer to this hot put where there's also a decent amount of liquidity on the bid around 5150 in the June S&P 500 futures contract. And folks, if you're watching this and you're enjoying the stream, let me know if you have any feedback, if you have any questions, if there's anything you'd like to see, any stocks or otherwise. And feel free to share the link to the stream with others. If you're on Twitter, retweet the post that's pinned in my profile. If you're on YouTube, share that link around for others that may enjoy this content. Let's go back to the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ looks like it's basing compared to the S&P, at least so far. And we do see some of those NASDAQ heavyweight stocks starting to show some of that look as well. So let's keep a close eye. NASDAQ does tend to be a leader in momentum, both intraday and over longer time horizons. So it's really important to watch. Continuing to see just a lot of call buying in NVIDIA. The 925s just saw about 250,000 in premium paid for those, expiring this Friday. And yeah, NASDAQ's starting to get a little bit of a bid off those lows here. Let's see how S&P is doing. It's following a bit. I'm just going to zoom in here. Look at the small caps, seeing a similar look there, and a decent amount of volume in that last little bit. Let's take a look at the dollar through the euro, through that lens. Just seeing some stability in the euro here. And let's look at some of these heavyweights. Nvidia starting to come back up here, kind of breaking that micro trend structure of lower highs and lower lows, making now higher lows and higher highs. SMCI still just stabilizing sideways. Meta starting to come off of its lows here, breaking above that 480.50 level, resting off or overhead. Amazon still looking pretty bad. Microsoft grinding sideways. Apple sort of just in this range between 173 and 174 over the last 30 minutes or so. And Google pulling back after making a break above 138, targeting that 138.40 level, but not quite being able to push above. And Tesla getting rejected here at 183. And we see cocoa trying to make new all-time highs here, bid quite well again, just like cotton, two of the momentum leaders in the commodity space. And sugar starting to look a little bit peppy. Maybe we made a double bottom in sugar. We'll be watching that one. Palladium also continuing to reverse off of its lows as we look around the commodity space. We see more SMCI calls trading for this Friday. 1100s, about 280,000 in premium paid for those. And S&P just pulling back after that little attempt to stabilize here. If we make another new low, that's definitely not a great sign. We do see a large amount of resting liquidity down around that 5150 level as we discussed. We also see the most active put activity in SPX continuing to move lower here. So that does suggest there's interest in even lower prices in the cash index today. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ. NASDAQ also pulling back to the lower end of this consolidation range. Russell have a somewhat similar look, just not a lot transacting in the Russell overall. Now let's look at some of these heavyweight stocks here. Nvidia stabilizing and trying to push back above the point of control in VWAP. First test didn't go so well, second test ongoing. SMCI just sort of flatlining here around the 1030s. Not a lot of action in the stock after that initial pullback this morning. And Meta was able to get above 480 where there was a large level of resting liquidity, now filling it in from the other side. And, not looking particularly buoyant overall. There's been a lot of funds coming into Meta over the last 10 minutes here. We can see that in the cumulative volume delta, only to get sold down here. So far, it's still a bit of a price war in this stock. Amazon looks just very, very sluggish here. Looks like sellers fully have control intraday. We're consolidating, so maybe there's a bit of a match between buyers and sellers around these price levels, but the stock has had a nasty trading tape so far today, as has Microsoft. Microsoft now breaking to new lows. And Apple giving up some of those earlier gains and seeing, like, it looks like 173 acting a bit like gravity here. Google also rolling over from those recent highs. Let's see how Tesla's doing here. Tesla also not able to crack that 183 level, now pulling back to 180 where there's a rather large bid. Let's get back to the S&P. And we'll zoom in a bit. And this morning, the New York Fed purchased 55 million of Treasury notes with maturities from 4.5 to 7 years in order to slow the roll of their balance sheet to meet their QT targets. We also got U.S. consumer inflation expectations, and
Bitcoin extends gains, rises 5.5%, last at $72,201.
and crypto's having quite a day. We also have a 3-year note auction coming up. So consumer inflation expectations should be at 11 a.m. 3-year note auction should be at 1 p.m. Tomorrow we'll get small business optimism, CPI.
Ticker NKG and November Kilo Golf November. So you're seeing continued heavy activity, new highs. Note this is a micro cap NKGN.
We'll get Redbook year over year tomorrow and a 10-year auction. So tomorrow's going to be a really big day for event volatility catalysts. I imagine that some folks are hedging today going into tomorrow. That could be some of what's pressuring markets this morning. If you're hedging, you're buying puts. If you're buying puts, market makers are hedging some of that exposure by selling ES, right? So that they can hedge their delta so they have to pay out on that put contract. They're not losing money. And Bitcoin topping 72,000 per coin for the first time ever. So a new all-time high in Bitcoin. We're not far from all-time highs in stocks. Housing prices in many regions are at or near all-time highs. Financial conditions are looser than when the Fed first started tightening. There's not a lot here to say that the Fed should be cutting anytime soon. Quite the opposite. And we see Fed funds futures pricing in just over 80 bips of cuts for 2024. So just over 3 cuts priced in for this year in Fed funds futures. We started this year with 5 to 6 priced in. So we are starting to see Fed funds futures come back to something that may resemble reality now. Seeing a bit of a reversal here in the S&P just over the last few minutes. Let's take a look around the market and see what's going on. NASDAQ, similar look, decent volume there. And Russell just pulling back a little bit, but stabilizing, at least so far in the microstructure. You can kind of see that look of making a higher high, maybe making a higher low here. We'll take a look and see what happens. Gold also stabilizing, a little bit of microstructure double bottom there happening for those who are a fan of that pattern, and getting back up to 21.89 where there's that next level of resting offer. Crude also stabilizing, but overall still a choppy day for crude, down about 1.5%, just below 77. And the euro, nice little pop there. That's showing the dollar some weakness. That's generally constructive for stocks. Let's take a look at those stocks. Nvidia now powering higher, can see it getting closer to 870 where there's a large resting offer. SMCI off the lows, but not really looking as strong as its bigger brother Nvidia. Meta just really not catching the memo that some of the rest of the market's catching a bid here, similar with Amazon, just kind of flat. Microsoft getting bid up a bit off of its lows here, back up to these larger areas of resting offers, just around 402.50 and 60. And Apple catching a bid off of its lows, really found some support down here around 173. Seems to be in a range between 173 and 174 so far. I think if it breaks decisively either side, we get continuation in
So
that
just
direction.
as an early reminder for our users, so tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, do you get the latest US CPI report. Also looking to the fear and greed index. So far it's at 63 out of 100, which indicates greed. crypto fear and greed index, 82 out of 100, which indicates extreme greed. Keeping an eye on the VIX as well, it is currently up 7.6% at 15.85.
And we do see Google, again, this is one of the stronger ones today, and it has been one of the weaker ones in the weeks leading up to today. After it reclaimed its 200-day moving average, the stock has been able to find its footing again. And the next area that we're really watching here has been that intraday level of resistance, which is around 138.30. You can also see there's large amounts of resting offer just here at 138.90 and 139. So those are two key levels to watch. And then, of course, the big level on the book is 140. And then Tesla here, also not really catching the memo, actually starting to give up some of those earlier gains. We'll go back to the S&P, which, look at that. That was a nice little pop, but let's contextualize it by zooming out a little bit. Still have some work to do to prove that the worst is behind it. It is pushing up above that gamma flip level, which is good, and we're getting right back up to the second most active put strike. And in the news earlier, Trump said a TikTok ban would empower Meta, and he went on to slam Facebook as an enemy of the people. And Pinduoduo's Timo shopping app has sparked a Wall Street frenzy as search reaches an all-time high. Continuing on the semiconductor theme here, ASML 1040s expiring April 19th on the call side, 100,000 in premium there. SMH 240s, 115,000 in premium paid for the April 19th expiration for those calls. Taiwan Semi 145s for April 19th, 152,000 in premium paid for those. AMD 230, 102,000 in premium paid for those expiring May 17th. So just across the board, lots of interest in semiconductor calls today. And looks like we did see some resistance right around that second most active put strike on ES so far. Let's just zoom out a little bit. Yeah, that hot put strike is still quite a bit lower, about 25 handles lower right now. We also have a large resting bid around 5150 with 271 contracts there. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ. NASDAQ getting a decent little pull here. We see sellers pulling that point of control lower to 18,160. And Russell still overall more constructive looking than its peers. So we're going to zoom out just a little bit on the S&P just to show the day's trading action. You can see we recently had this bit of a pop. It was on decent volume, and buyers were pretty aggressive in that. But now we're seeing that taken out, and sellers are not really having to push very hard to do that. There's not, essentially, it's more of like a buyer's strike than just sellers taking control of the tape, because as you can see, it took a lot of effort from buyers to make this little 10-point pop. It's not taking nearly as much effort from sellers to pull price right back down to where we started. And we see not the same look in the NASDAQ quite as much, although there was more buying to the upside. I would say S&P is really having that look much more pronounced overall. Now, earlier, sellers did have to exert a lot of effort to push price lower. So this may be just a little bit of a change in character. Buyers starting to be a little bit more reluctant to, defend price here. And folks, this is going to be an interesting week. We've got a lot going on. You've got over $100 billion of treasury auctions. You've got CPI, you've got PPI, you've got University of Michigan consumer sentiment, and of course you have options expiration. And next week you have volatility product expiration on Wednesday, not this week, which does make it a little bit trickier to hedge. And sometimes when you have expiration after OPEX, it adds to some of that volatility. You also do have some interesting earnings. I'll be watching Oracle and Adobe this week. Oracle is one that I actually think is a decent company. I know a lot of people got pretty frustrated with them after they dropped from their prior earnings. I saw that as a buying opportunity. And I talked about that a bit. And I think that this is it's a compounder. This is not a mega growth company. It's not going to be the next NVIDIA, but it is a company that is thoroughly entrenched in a number of key verticals. And so it's a hard company to bet against. It's more a company where it's just, sort of buy the dips over long periods of time tends to work well in Oracle. Got more NVIDIA action happening now. We've got the 1080 calls being bought for May 17th, 1.13 million. Also, Meta 480s for May 17th, 1.84 million on the call side. And another sweep of 1080s for NVIDIA, same date, 1.142 million. So again, lots of interest in the semis on the call side today. That's a continuation of a theme we've been talking about. We do see skew in NVIDIA blown way out to the call side, similar look in SMH, and it illustrates a relative sense of euphoria. There's really no concern about downside versus upside in these. And we just talked about Pinduoduo PDD 120 calls, 125,000 in premium paid for next Friday. So that's becoming another darling of Wall Street due to Temu. And NASDAQ starting to get a bit of a pop here, but let's see where it goes. A little early yet. We're going to also watch the same in the S&P. S&P not really showing us that same move. Euro did make that big bounce, helped to stabilize the currency a bit versus the dollar. That helped to bring a little bit of life back to stocks, but right now it's just sort of consolidating. NVIDIA taking out 870, so nice little $20 pop basically there over the last 25 minutes. Got a large resting offer overhead at 875. And another smaller but still significant one at 880. And then on the bid side, 850 and 845, quite significant. SMCI finally starting to show some life here, trading up $20 or so in the last 10 minutes. Looking like it's stabilizing, seeing some buyers with conviction coming in. You can see those in the larger bubbles, those larger delta prints. And Meta just continues to grind lower. It's just sort of ignoring what's happening in the rest of the market as these large resting bids below stack up and increase. Amazon getting a nice little pop off that 171.50 level where there's not only a large resting bid, but also you can see in the session volume profile, there's some aggressive selling there. So buyers are trying to push sellers really further out of control on this stock, encourage some more short covering should we see it. And Microsoft, nice little pop there, getting back up to 402.80 and absorbing that resting offer up there. Apple, after a really promising start, really not looking so good today, kind of resuming that trend that we've gotten used to with Apple. And Google, you know, it had a nice move, but, and we'll zoom out to contextualize that. We can see that from the open, but now it seems to have lost some of that steam. So we'll be watching Google here, see if it can get its mojo back. And then finally, Tesla. Tesla's slipping after it hit a lot of resistance at that huge resting offer at 183. And now we're finally starting to see some buyers coming back with a little bit of conviction into ES. Let's see how this goes. Again, it's been a bit of a struggle to see a sustained up move so far today. But they are actually pushing in with a decent amount of volume here. And we could reasonably expect to see some resistance around that Gamma 1 level. That's where the vol trigger was. That is the largest or second largest area of gamma positioning on the chain. More Pinduoduo options coming through. 125s for last Friday of March. 399,000 in premium paid for those. Also got Northrop Grumman, a little bit of a bid for the defense contractor here. 465s for May 17th, 136,000 in premium. Another lot for the NVIDIA 1080s. 1.13 million paid for that May 17th expiration. And NASDAQ punching here, while S&P is comparatively a little bit of a laggard. NASDAQ here punching right above that VWAP level. Let's take a look at some of the hot NASDAQ stocks here. NVIDIA, of course, leading the way. Was able to absorb that large resting offer at 875, now pushing up to 880. SMCI following right along. Finally found a bidder for SMCI today. It's up about 40 bucks off its lows now. And it's still going, as we could see. Meta now, look at that. Someone found the will to buy Meta out of that downtrend. So 476 becoming a reasonably large area of support with the VWAP just a overhead and a decent size offer around 489, 485 on that stock. Amazon getting a nice bid here off the lows, continuing to push higher into a large area of resting liquidity around 172.60. And Microsoft, nice push higher there, right back up to the point of control, and a large resting offer around 404. Apple still kind of grinding sideways here, but off its lows, finding support at 173. And Google now back to doing business, trying to push above. I'm sorry, we're looking at Google here, trying to push above that 130.25 to 138.50 level. That 138.25 to 138.50 level has a lot of resting offers above, so it's acted as resistance so far. And finally, Tesla's still kind of grinding lower here. S&P really making a nice little move. Decent amount of conviction on the buy side here, pushing above the gamma flip level back into positive gamma territory and above that former vol trigger level. Got more Meta options activity, the 500s for this Friday. 104,000 paid for those calls. NVIDIA 900s for this Friday, 186,000 paid for those. Pinterest 36 strike for May 17th, 481,000 paid for those. Again, on the options activity on the unusual side, it is mostly about bullish bets. And that is helping to give the NASDAQ some relative strength from the open versus the S&P. particularly from the recovery from recent lows. So it's really going to be all about tomorrow's CPI data. I think that's the most important data point for this market right now. Then we'll have PPI on Thursday, UOM, consumer
That's your
consumer
PBR,
sentiment
Papa
on
Bravo,
Friday.
Romeo. Sure seeing a spike in activity, new highs, PBR.
And we did talk about PBR earlier. We saw some call sweeps coming into that one. It had a recently that stock has pulled back quite a bit. So not too surprising to see some buyers start to circle back in. S&P continuing to build here. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ. NASDAQ, very similar look. Right, grinding right above this VWAP level, starting to have a more bullish appearance on the NASDAQ. Russell also starting to look a little bit more constructive, albeit quite choppy. Gold coming back. That double bottom we talked about earlier playing out. Not a terribly high amount of
So
excitement
according
off that
to
low,
a poll, the
still.
Federal Reserve to first cut Fed funds rate in June, say 72 of 108 economists. And from another poll, the bigger risk of March dot plot shows fewer rate cuts, say 38 of 44 economists. And the Federal Reserve to cut rates by 75 basis points or less in 2024, say 52 of 108 economists. 26 say 100 basis points.
NVIDIA 1050s for next Friday, 112,000 in premium paid for those calls. Just so much of that flow coming through. It's pretty incredible. Palantir, $30 calls for, looks like August 16th. Also just came through on a pretty aggressive sweep, 264,000 in premium paid. S&P not able to get to that VWAP or point of control level, so looking a little bit less convincing on that move up in the S&P versus the NASDAQ. We do see the midpoint on screen, and it does correlate pretty well with the point of control. The midpoint happens when the SPX options visualizer detects that the flow between the top two calls and the top two puts are relatively equal, and as a result, it paints that midpoint to say this is kind of the area of balance in the market. And we can see the point of control right there as well, so that no coincidence, the options flow and the futures flow agree, in part because options are the tail that wags the dog, right? Across all equity index futures, about 400 billion of notional trades every day. Across SPX index options alone, 1.2 trillion in premium. So it's a pretty big difference. That's one reason I believe it is important to watch options, because they do provide us clues. Got Taiwan Semi May 17th sweeps for the 150 strike. About 1.8 million in premium paid for those. And seeing S&P just roll over a bit after that pop. Take a look at the NASDAQ here. Pretty similar look in the NASDAQ as well. Now crossing below that VWAP level and heading towards the point of control. Very topsy-turvy trading day today. One thing to bear in mind about OPEX week is it does tend to be a lot more like this, particularly when you have futures contracts rolling. So you have so many large players that just have to move positions, right? So that's going to cause some of the traditional outcomes that one might expect to not quite have the same statistical probabilities or significance. Let's take a look at the euro here. Euro continuing now to kind of pull back after that rally, a little bit of a pop after that. The euro is a good one to watch.
That's your
This is a
AISP, Alpha
proxy
India,
for the
Sandy
dollar.
Papa. Sure seeing continued activity, new highs. AISP.
So I like to watch the euro as a proxy for the dollar. It's about 70% of the weighting in the US dollar index. And since S&P companies get about 40% of their revenue overseas, knowing how the dollar is doing and the intermarket dynamics between the dollar and price discovery in the S&P and NASDAQ, it's important. Weaker dollar, stronger stocks, stronger dollar, weaker stocks is typically how it goes. Let's take a look at NVIDIA here. Little bit of a pull, but still kind of making a nice reversal. I mean, if we look at this thing from earlier, we'll just zoom out. We can see it just had this sort of consolidation, a drop. Now it's got this structure of higher highs and higher lows. So NVIDIA stock objectively looking more constructive after that pull earlier today. And those options flows, of course, helping to support it now. There was a little bit of a lag. As we discussed earlier, they weren't really supporting it before. Now I feel like those premiums are enough that you're starting to see that dealer hedging impact on the share price. SMCI looks a lot like NVIDIA here, and it's popped just about $40, $45 off of its lows. Meta finally starting to show a little bit of strength here, popped right off that 476 level where there's a very large bid. When you see that, it's typically bullish, but we are seeing some resistance here at VWAP. Want to see how that resolves. Amazon also starting to show that strength, similar look as Meta. Microsoft, similar look as the prior two. And Apple just grinding lower here. Had a promising start earlier. Let's zoom out so we can see that. Remember when Apple was doing well? We had this nice pop. Now we're just starting to grind lower below the point of control, below VWAP, and looking like we might be closing in on 172 as we filled that large resting bid at 173. You could see there was a lot of absorption of buyers there, but they weren't able to defend price, at least of yet. So we'll be watching Apple here. And Google just kind of in a range here, consolidating those post-open gains. And Tesla, very similar look here. At least it's above 180 for the Tesla bulls, that 177.77 level being a key pivot for the EV maker. We'll pop the S&P 500 futures back on screen, and I'm just going to hop off mic for a little bit. I'll be right back. All right, folks, I'm back. It looks like the market waited for me, as it didn't seem to do much while I was away. All right, market, I'm back. You can do whatever it is you were waiting for.
So the Bank of England sells £799.9 million of bonds in auction and receives £2.22 billion in bids. They say APF gilt sale operation cover ratio was 2.78.
Got some more Pinduoduo options for April 19th, about 135,000 in premium for the 120s. Airbnb 165s for June 21st, about 431,000 paid for those. NVIDIA 900s for this Friday, 176,000 paid for those. And gold miners showing some interest. GDX, the gold senior miner ETF, 33 strike for June 21st, 182,000 paid for those. BITO, that Bitcoin ETF, 34 strike. Looking at May 17th, about 200,000 paid for those. And then Mara, the Bitcoin miner, January 17th, 2025, the 25 strike, 348,000 paid for those. So still seeing a fair amount of interest in calls versus puts. On the unusual flow side of things, I'm going to say it's about 4-1 right now. And we're just pinging that gamma 1 level from below. That is providing a little bit of resistance here so far. But it looks like we're starting to make that push. And we see that midpoint now just sort of correlating with VWAP. Point of control has been pushed higher a bit.
At 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we get New York Fed inflation expectations.
And we will be watching those inflation expectations on CPI week here. But we do see some buyers coming back in here really over the last 15 minutes. We've been seeing net buying in the cumulative volume delta. That delta number is just really looking at the last 30 minutes of tape. So it's more for short term rather than the cumulative delta for the entire day. And we'll take a look around some of these other stocks that are the NASDAQ heavyweights here. But first, let's take a look at the NASDAQ itself. So it is starting to make a nice little push here. Once again, above this volume-weighted average price and now starting to make new highs. So the NASDAQ is starting to pave the way for a bit of an intraday recovery here. Let's see if the S&P can catch that memo. I'd like to see it break above this VWAP and point of control to really show buyers are taking control of the 500 S&P 500 large cap and mega cap index. But NASDAQ, again, that intraday relative strength, before it was down 0.6%, the S&P was down 0.4%. Now the NASDAQ is down just 0.24%, while the S&P is down about 1/3%. So you can see that turnaround, that relative strength coming back into the NASDAQ versus the S&P intraday. Have a few questions out there I'm going to get to. Someone asked, do I ever trade options strategies? Yes, I do. I do trade options strategies mostly on a multi-week and multi-month basis. I generally prefer spreads in terms of options trades, diagonals, verticals, calendar spreads. But yeah, I do enjoy trading options mostly on a swing time frame and mostly using spreads for bullish and bearish positions. Someone else asks, what is the SPX options visualizer? So the SPX options visualizer is what you see on the right tab here of my Bookmap screen. And what it does is it analyzes about 10,000 options in the S&P 500 index. Those are all traded on CBOE. It updates the information every single minute. So every 60 seconds, it's analyzing about 250,000 data points. And it updates that to show these different key levels. So you can see the hot call and warm call and hot put and warm put. Those are the most active and second most active strikes for the call and the put on the S&P 500 options chain. You've got the midpoint. That is the point that is shown when there's a relative balance between call buying and put buying, or call transacting and put transacting in those top two strikes. It's going to paint that midpoint on screen because it's showing you there's some degree of balance. And indeed, we can see the price of the S&P 500 futures getting right back up to that midpoint level as well with that relative balance in options. I mean, each one of these contracts, about 16,000 contracts transacted so far today. So you could say there's some relative balance there. That's why we're seeing that midpoint. You've got the volatility trigger. That's the largest area of gross gamma positioning that is below price. So typically when you push through that level, you start to see some more volatility come in. You've also got the gamma flip level, which just disappeared because it's getting kind of overlapped.
That's 11
by the
a.m.
midpoint,
Eastern time. We
but
get
you can
New
see
York
it as
Fed
I zoom in,
inflation
it's back
expectations.
in. And what that's showing you is where the naive model that I have, which is assuming all these contracts that are bought to open, which is true for a lot of them. Anyway, it shows where we would slip into negative gamma territory, right? So it's basically a visualization of all the key options positioning, the largest gamma levels outside of the vol trigger on a net and gross basis. And what this does is it helps to find convergences between flows and positioning in S&P options and where there's interest and where there's price action in S&P 500 futures. Now, we know that S&P 500 futures trade at a premium to cash, right? There's a premium in the futures that has a lot to do with that term structure of contango. And so, as you go further out, there's a larger delta between ES and SPX. So every night, I recalculate that delta so that when you're seeing the SPX options visualizer levels from SPX, they're translated to levels that correlate to ES, right? So it's still relevant in the context of futures. So hopefully that helps. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions on that. Someone asks, do I have any training on Bookmap and Gamma in the Discord? As a matter of fact, we have tons of resources on Bookmap and Gamma and options trading and futures and otherwise, both on the Traderade Discord and on our website under the educational section of our feed. So definitely great stuff to check out. If you are enjoying Bookmap, by the way, and you're interested in considering picking it up, you can get it for up to 40% off by going to traderade.com/bookmap and scrolling down to the specials. You're welcome. And someone said, nice stream, so thank you. And we've got about 2.5 minutes till we get the New York Fed inflation expectation survey data, which will give us a sense as to what consumers are looking for these inflation numbers looking ahead. I've got a couple of different, so someone asked what audio is playing in the background. I've got a couple of different news squawk services. Financial Juice and Benzinga are the two that we have that I'm sharing with you all today. And if you're interested in either one, let me know in a DM. I can get you some discounts if you want them. They're also available on our Discord during the trading day in our trading room. Yeah, you're welcome. We'd love to have you join us. So we see S&P just sort of hovering around the point of control and VWAP and midpoint level. Again, we talked about this earlier as being sort of a trifecta, an area of convergences that are important. I think if we did push above that point of control and build some acceptance there, we've got some room to continue higher. So let's see how that goes. I'm going to just change the color scheme on the CVD here so it doesn't overlap with the iceberg color scheme. So just bear with me here. There we go. Probably have to do that on some of these other contracts as well. But yeah, we'll take a look at that as we need to. And we do see a little bit of resistance at that point of control so far. So let's just go around the map here. We've got the NASDAQ. It also popped. It's actually slipping a little bit more than the S&P after
1
that
minute
recent
remaining.
pop. Got 1 minute till the data. So we'll wait to do our roundabout until we get the data. Let's see how we react across multiple areas in this market.
Ten seconds. So New York Fed says consumers hold steady on expected income and earnings gains in February. And US one-year inflation expectations unchanged at 3%. 5-year inflation expectations rise to 2.9% in February from 2.5% seen previously. And consumers are more downbeat on job markets in February. And the February expected year-ahead rent rise to the lowest since December 2020. And expected home prices rise flat in February at 3%. And February 3-year ahead inflation expectations 2.7% versus January's 2.4%.
Interesting. Seeing inflation expectations on the rise a bit here. See if we get any reaction in the 10-year note futures. Just a tiny bit of a pull. How about that euro? Tiny bit of a pull, not much there. Going back to S&P, seeing a bit of a build above the point of control so far.
I know ticker SB, Sandy, Bravo, sure seeing a spike in activity. No circulations, a new Zach's pick for SB.
So 5-year inflation expectations rose to 2.9% in February from 2.5%. 3-year to 2.7 from 2.4%. So definitely seeing some of those longer term inflation expectations rising, but not necessarily becoming unanchored. And the expected year ahead rent rise is the lowest since December of 2020. Consumers are also more downbeat on the job market in February. And still a bit of a struggle for the S&P to really overcome this point of control so far. See how the NASDAQ is faring here. While it's above its respective point of control, it's also slipping from its recent highs. Let's take a look at the euro, just sort of consolidating here. Point of control is pulled higher by buyers, but we have slipped below it. No real reaction in 10-year note futures. Let's take a look at NVIDIA. NVIDIA trading around 883.09. Fairly large amount of resting liquidity above us here at 888 and 890. And got a decent resting bid at 875, below at 870. But this one overall has recovered nicely from that pull. We'll go back, zoom out this chart again, just so we can look at that microstructure. And you can see it had that pull earlier in the day. We recovered, we pulled back again, and then we started to see just a steady stream of accumulation. This is exactly the type of microstructure you want to see if you're bullish on something, right? You've got higher lows, higher highs, higher lows, higher highs. You know, this is a very constructive pattern that helped to build that run that took us up about $40 from the lows. SMCI, quite a similar look as NVIDIA. You know, you can see it had that big pull, and now it's recovering with a similar kind of microstructure uptrend. Meta, also pretty similar look here, and it found that support around 476. You know, that was where there was, at the time, a very large resting bid. And now we see a large resting offer coming up above us at 491 on Meta. We'll have to see if that acts as resistance here. Then we've got Amazon here. Amazon's had a nice recovery off these lows. We did see 172. That area provided some support. Once we broke above it, we didn't really go back. And now we're getting back into this area around 173, just above that VWAP. So looking at more constructive, consolidating for the next move here in Amazon. Microsoft just below this point of control, above VWAP. Large layer of bids coming in at 403. Really large offer up here at 405. We'll have to keep an eye on it. Microsoft just hasn't had too much spunk today. And then Apple, oof, not looking so good. So this is one, again, earlier today, this one looked like the opposite of the rest of them. It actually rallied into some of the weakness that we saw off of its pre-market lows. Now we've just come right back. We're consolidating here, but we've just come right back to around those low levels. And we do have this large resting bid at 172 and a large resting offer over us around 173.25. Google overall still looking pretty constructive today. Again, it has that same kind of microstructure, although it's starting to consolidate here. Looks more at balance, where we have this sort of matched, you know, area of highs and lows where we're not really breaking out of that range. So let's see if it can get above. I'm going to call it 139 to really be convincing that there's more upside, because there's such a large resting offer up there. And then finally, we have Tesla, which is slipping back. Tesla was doing really well earlier today. I mean, look, I have to zoom out to show just how well it was doing. Had that pop up to 183, and wouldn't you know it, that really large resting offer overhead, that acted as resistance. The stock has not really been able to find its footing since. So we'll go back here to the S&P 500 futures, which are just sort of continuing to grind around the point of control. And we can see that New York Fed survey, that was not a big event volatility catalyst, didn't really have much of an effect on liquidity or price discovery overall. Let's take a look around the options complex. There's been no shortage of fun there. Meta 510s for April 19th, 101,000 premium trading for those calls. NVIDIA 900s, a familiar one for this Friday, 170,000 premium bidding on those calls. SMCI 1260s for this Friday, 100,000 premium chasing those calls. GLD 205s for July 19th, 191,000 in premium looking at those calls. And Broadcom 1200s for this Friday, 175,000 in premium there. Apple 250s for 2026, 98,000 in premium. Someone looking to chase Apple quite a bit higher, just a little under 2 years out. And still the unusual call flow significantly outpacing that on the unusual put side for single stocks and ETFs. And this from Benzinga's Wire. Top Wall Street analysts flag U.S. market concentration anxiety, advising investors to adopt a barbell approach so they have more exposure outside of some of the most concentrated parts of the market, which I think is indeed a wise idea. RSP, or the S&P Equal Weight ETF, is one of the areas that one can look at to get that sort of exposure. And seeing a bit of a pull here in the S&P. Let's see what's going on over here in the NASDAQ. Similar look in the NASDAQ as well, pulling back below the point of control and into VWAP. Russell just sort of ignoring all the price action we're seeing there. Maybe it'll be a latecomer to the party. Gold stable. Oil's coming off its lows, now trading at 77.60. 10-year note futures pretty stable, not a lot going on there. Similar with the euro, so we'll skip right past the other currencies here, go right to NVIDIA. NVIDIA seeing a bit of a pull, that 888 level and 890, those large resting offers overhead, acting a bit as resistance, and that sort of constructive micro trend, uptrend structure seems to be breaking down now. SMCI, similar look. Meta consolidating but looking heavy. And Amazon looking a bit heavy here as well, but buyers really trying to absorb that selling pressure. Microsoft also getting that distributive look now, really
Iceberg
making a pull
ESM
here.
for CME sell at 51.69 crossed 500.
Ooh, and we just got an alert of a large iceberg sell here in the S&P as we can see that pullback accelerating. So those audio alerts will come in when there is something of unusual size happening. And there was a huge iceberg sell right here. You can see it on screen. What that's showing you is that someone came in with, looks like 2,145 ES contracts on the sell side. And buyers tried to absorb that, but that nevertheless led to a bit of a pull there. And you see a bit of a similar look in the NASDAQ, but it looks like most of that was led with S&P. So let's zoom in a little bit more on the microstructure here. We can see we're pinging that vol trigger and gamma flip level again, just under the midpoint and VWAP. So we'll get back into some of the stocks. I just want to go back to the S&P because we got that large trade alert. So Microsoft, again, kind of pulling back. We saw that in Microsoft stock, actually, as that alert was crossing. Microsoft was getting pulled down lower. Apple, also, that large resting bid at 172, just growing a little bit over the last half hour, looking a little bit more magnetic for the second biggest company here. Google overall still constructive, still a micro trend, uptrend structure here overall. So we'll be watching this one, but it did have plenty of supply overhead here. So it's seeing some consolidation below it. And Tesla continuing to pull back after its recent strength. And finally, let's look at the SMH ETF. Nasty business there. Really starting to give up some of its gains. It still had a decent run from the open, but you can see this has just been really volatile trading today. We're seeing a little bit of a bid come back at the VWAP level. Maybe we'll find some support there in the ETF, but this is an ETF where 10% of it is Taiwan Semi and 25% of it is NVIDIA. So it's kind of just the NVIDIA Taiwan Semi ETF. Going back to the S&P here.
Fed bids for 3-month bills total $330.6 million, and Fed bids for 6-month bills total $292.9 million.
And the Fed does continue to bid for bills because they roll off their balance sheet faster than how they have their QT targets allotted. And that's one of the things that you kind of hear about, and some folks will confuse that and say, oh, they're still doing QE, but they're not. They're just slowing the pace of QT so it doesn't exceed what their targeted allotments are for each of those tenors. And NASDAQ S&P, kind of a similar look, stabilizing after that recent pull. S&P down about 1/3% on cash. NASDAQ now down about 0.4%. With VIX spot up about 2.34% to 1543. And natural gas just having another pretty nasty day. Down close to 2%. There was some hope that that recent rally might take shape into something bigger. But, you know, for the natural gas bulls out there, or just people that are looking at it as a speculative investment or trading vehicle, my thought is natural gas's seasonality really starts to improve in April. So that's something to take into consideration. And B, I favor being long the companies rather than the stuff itself. Natural gas, playing it with UNG is pretty awful, but even trading natural gas futures can be a bit anxiety provoking because it trades all over the map, and you can't really take large position sizes because of that volatility, right? If your general rule of thumb is you don't want to lose a lot of your portfolio on a single trade, then the idea is don't take a really large position in anything too volatile. So I'd rather trade XOP, which is an oil and gas ETF, or strong natural gas companies like FANG, Diamondback.
It's 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. The US sells $79 billion in 3-month bills, prior high yield 5.24%, and a prior bid cover of 2.65. And the US sells $70 billion in 6-month bills, prior high yield 5.105%, and a prior bid cover of 2.59.
Decent auction, and wouldn't expect anything less from bills right now as long as the reverse repo is reasonably sized. NASDAQ looking a little bit weaker here than S&P. Let's take a look at the Russell, kind of rolling over a bit here as well. We'll take a look at gold. Gold building some strength up here, now trading just under 21.90. Let's zoom out a little bit. On this heat map, look at that large resting offer at 2,200 on this gold front month contract. That is a really important level for this market. Gold 2,200, 116 on the offer. Let's take a look at oil here. We can see there's a reasonable amount of resting liquidity both below and above this 76 level and 79 level, really the largest two levels to watch where there's interest in crude. And this is West Texas Intermediate. Moving over here to the euro. The euro had a nice move higher earlier today, and it's just really been rolling over ever since, right? So you can kind of see the overnight session. You had the big dump into the U.S. session, and that's just sort of continuing. Now we're stabilizing. We had a little bit of a pop pre-market. We had another attempt. Now we're just moving sideways, consolidating here. But that strength in the dollar, typically not a good thing for equities. So we'll be watching the euro and how it trades because of those intermarket dynamics. The yen actually climbing a bit higher here, but overall a similar look as the euro if we look at the overnight session. And NVIDIA, you know, kind of right back to that distributive look. We talked about the microstructure changing here as we made a lower low, and now we seem to be set to make another lower low here, challenging VWAP from above. SMCI not quite as weak as NVIDIA in appearance so far, but still getting a bit of distribution from that attempt at 1100 where it was rejected at both the point of control and a large resting offer. And we've got Meta here. Meta looks overall a little bit more comparatively constructive. It did roll over, but now it's starting to show just a little bit of strength off those lows. Amazon looking pretty bad, making a new low intraday. This one had been kind of all over the map today. Going into today's session, there was a big sell, got a bid off that low around 171.50, and now we're starting to see sellers take control, but really not a lot of aggression here on either side of the tape. Microsoft just sort of consolidating after its sell, and Apple looking a little bit more constructive than its peers. It seems like when this market's under greater pressure, Apple seems to do better. Google, a similar look as Apple. And Tesla just sort of consolidating after that that failed attempt to break higher. So we were as high as, 183 earlier, and we've just been distributing since then. We got almost 183. We got kind of knocked by that large resting offer around 183 in Tesla. So we'll zoom out just a little bit in the S&P for context. It does look like you're seeing folks kind of try to stabilize this around the midpoint, around the VWAP. This is a an options market that in the S&P, if we zoom out, we can see is in relative balance. You've got 23,000 on the hot and warm puts, about 46,000 total across those two, about 42,000 versus the two most active call strikes, right? So the midpoint's on screen showing us a market that's in some degree of balance in terms of options flow.
It's 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. The US sells $79 billion in 3-month bills. Prior high yield 5.24% and a prior bid cover of 2.65. And the US sells $70 billion in 6-month bills. Prior high yield 5.105% and a prior bid cover of 2.59.
We've got more calls for Mara coming in. 23 strike for May 17th, 101,000 premium paid there. And NVIDIA, the 900's pretty hot for this Friday. Another about 390,000 in premium coming into those. Coinbase 340s for Jan 2025, 162,000 in premium. Just all across the call side. Again, the unusual flows pretty significant today. So the bulls are not giving up on their attempts to both speculate on a higher market and even push the market higher. And believe it or not, there are some NVIDIA put flows coming through as well. The 850 strike for this Friday, there's about 350,000 in premium. Just came over the tape. I'm not sure if that's illegal to buy puts on NVIDIA. Half kidding. Got to have a little levity in this market, right? Certainly hasn't been a winning strategy. Except for maybe Friday. Meta 500s, 274,000 paid for December 20th expiration. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ seems a bit comparatively weaker, just visually speaking, versus the S&P. We also see that earlier relative strength kind of rolling off now. S&P is down 0.4% on cash, NASDAQ down about 0.5%. Before the NASDAQ was trading just a little bit stronger than the S&P in relative terms. Let's look at some of these market internals while we're taking a look at the market overall. Breadth is, well, it's not great. 34.3% advancers versus 61.1% decliners across U.S. listed equities. Of those equities, we've got about 67% above their 50-day moving average and 68% above their 200-day moving average. Inside the S&P, you've got some reasonable distributive pressure in technology, financials, cyclicals, industrials, real estate, utilities a bit lagging, and there is a decent bid in basic materials today.
Shortly expecting the results of the 3 and 6 month bill auctions.
I'm going to step away from the mic for just a moment. The news squawk will still be there, and I will be right back.
Ticker BTI, Bravo Tango India shares seeing a spike in activity. BTI headline: BAT said planning to sell about 2 to 3 billion of ITC block trades. It's BTI.
So 6 month bill high yield 5.1%, 5.1% bid to cover ratio 2.95, 2.95. The US sells $70 billion in 6 month bills and awards 76.61% of bids at high. And 3 month bill high yield 5.25%, 5.25% bid to cover ratio 2.53, 2.53. The US sells $79 billion in 3 month bills and awards 33.87% of bids at high.
All right, folks, I am back. Looks like the pull in the market is building just a little bit here. We do see a large resting offer coming up at 51.75 on ES. So we'll be watching that there. That's interesting. And 51.50 still on the books there on that bid. And we can see that most active put strike moving a bit lower here. Right just below that second most active put strike. So we do see interest in this market lower. And we also see that midpoint, it's still on the tape, but we do see the volume towards put starting to become a little bit more aggressive. And NVIDIA 900s for next Friday, 729,000 paid for those calls. We'll just zoom out a little bit so we can see some of these key options levels shown by the Advanced SPX Options Visualizer. That is a plugin available on the Bookmap Marketplace now. And I am, for a limited time, offering lifetime subscriptions to it. So check it out. If you like what you see, you can also get up to 40% off of Bookmap by visiting traderade.com/bookmap. For the plugin, visit traderade.com/SPX. MicroStrategy $2,000 calls for next Friday, 107,000 in premium paid. Lots of activity in that stock today. It's really a day where semis and crypto are getting a lot of the unusual call activity. MicroStrategy now trading much higher than earlier. Remember, it fell from 1550 down to about 1487. Now trading at 1623. So maybe we'll bring up MicroStrategy on screen since it's so active today. And we'll give it a moment to kind of populate. I'll clean up the chart. It's just so we don't have too much going on. And then we'll pull back maybe, let's see, we've been open for about 2 hours. We'll pull back about 2 hours of data here for MicroStrategy. There it is. Wow, what a trading day in MicroStrategy. Look at that. Just bonkers. It's like a leveraged Bitcoin ETF. And it's pretty much what Saylor has turned the company into. And pretty choppy trade. Looks like S&P wants to start to make another pull down, though. That microstructure is starting to look a little bit more bearish here. NASDAQ as well, and there is a little bit more seller aggression, as you can see by the size of these delta bubbles here. Russell still not really getting the memo yet. Gold now within scratching distance of that big resting offer at 2,200. Oil pushing up higher now. Was trading below 77. Now it's trading above 78 and getting closer to that large resting offer at 79. Rates pretty stable as we see in the 10s. Dollar moving higher as the euro rolls over here. And NVIDIA, you know, it made a nice little run, but again, we talked about this break in the microstructure here. It continues to look a little bit more bearish after that break intraday. And SMCI, not quite as weak as NVIDIA, but it had a slower start to get going on that reversal. Meta still looking a bit distributive after it made that run. You know, this is maybe looking like this is going to be a lower high. Let's see how it resolves. Amazon, very similar look as Meta. A lot of that index-driven price discovery. Microsoft showing some more weakness here. A pull down to about 402 here, where there is a large level of resting liquidity in this stock. And a large level also at 401.50. And then a really, really large group just around 401. Apple, see a huge bid coming in here around 172.65. That's about 50,000 shares on bid right there. That was a level that Apple was trading below earlier. And remember, with Apple, it seems to go the opposite way as some of these other stocks. Like you've got Amazon, you know, not looking quite as good. Apple's going the other way, right? Google, same thing. Google now within scratching distance of that large resting offer at 139. We've been talking about this one all day. It's shown a lot of relative strength versus its peers. And it's one of the few that hasn't really broken out of a constructive trend. It's gone from, you know, an uptrend to consolidation back to an uptrend, but it never really had that break look, that downtrend look that some of its peers did. And Tesla just continuing to grind lower, now below that key pivot of 177.77 in the EV maker. So that's not a good look, looking quite bearish in Tesla now, with resting liquidity building below in large size. We'll see if any of those levels offer support. And now back to the S&P. So far, definitely seeing something that's of some level of interest, which is this 5,100 level on SPX, the cash index. There is a significant amount of options positioning in that part of the chain, which is likely one reason that it's been a pretty important level to watch today. We can see that's pretty much been the low, is right around 5,100 on SPX. So far, we consider that a key level of support to watch. We've had some tests very briefly, and we saw a rebid come in from there. I would say that that's going to be the line in the sand. If we do start to push below SPX 5,100 and build some acceptance there, I do think selling would build into that. Otherwise, it's likely to be a bit of a trampoline, providing some room to get back into the sort of this mode of consolidation, right? Because if we look at the way price has been trading here, it's mostly been a game of consolidation. There have been some attempts to push lower. Those were bid, right? That's as we got closer to that key level. So I think the low of today, like
I figure INPX, Indian November
59.120.
Papa X, right? This is a micro cap. Company is saying the closing will be after market close on March 12th.
And that same low was right around here, where we did see some iceberg interest in buying as well.
No, this is for the XTI merger and share consolidation.
So as long as we're above SPX 5,100, it's hard to bet too aggressively against this thing. NASDAQ getting a nice bid there. A little bit more robust than what we're seeing in the S&P. Let's take a look around some of these NASDAQ stocks that might be helping to power this move higher. Start with NVIDIA here. Get a pop off of its point of control in VWAP, but that doesn't seem to be where the big bid is coming in. SMCI really starting to come back up to its recent highs. Meta getting a nice pop off of its lows here, breaking that distributive microstructure. Amazon just sort of consolidating. Microsoft, huge bid there. That's definitely part of the move. Apple, kind of tepid. Google right under that key 139 level. Let's see if it can take that out and build some more momentum. And Tesla grinding lower here, actually. Looking not so great overall. SMH, the semiconductor ETF, that's a third NVIDIA and Taiwan Semi, recovering nicely off its lows. And MicroStrategy pulling back after that pop above 1,600. Also seeing some unusual call buying in Chinese options. FXI, 24.5 for end of this month. 231,000 premium paid for those calls. KWeb, that's the Chinese tech stocks. 2650 strike for the end of this month. 560,000 in premium paid there. And of course, we talked about Pinduoduo earlier. So we're going to go right back to the heart of it all with the S&P 500 here. And let's contextualize this move by just zooming out so we can see, the whole day's structure here. So still well below the highs, but also well below the lows. You kind of got a bit of a pennant forming, right? Lower, smaller and smaller ranges of price. Let's see if we break above the point of control here. That would kind of have us breaking out of that same pattern. Options flow is still pretty balanced across both sides. We still see the midpoint. And the most active call strike just below 5,200 on ES. NASDAQ down about 1/3%. S&P down just about 0.3%. Analysts saying Duolingo, the language learning app, poised for strong user growth. And other analysts weighing in saying gold speculators paved the way for multi-year bull market in the metals. That speculative positioning in gold still relatively low considering where price action has been. So many missed the rally, meaning they're likely to buy in later into this momentum. Just looking at the economic calendar for today, we have a 3-year note auction coming up at 1 p.m. S&P seeing a little resistance here just at that point of control, which sellers did pull just a bit lower earlier here. NASDAQ seeing just a little bit of a pull, although it's above its respective point of control and VWAP. Russell overall looking like it's trying to rebound here. The small caps have just had a bit of a topsy-turvy day. If we zoom out here, we can see that. Got dumped after an initial bid into the cash open and have just really been struggling to recover from there. Gold consolidating as it tries to make that push up to 2,200. We still see a large resting offer at that level. We also see another one kind of starting to build at around 21.99. Crude continuing to build its upward momentum, potentially targeting that 79 resting offer, and 78.50 also growing. Ahead of the 3-year note auction, the 2-year note futures are relatively stable here. Really not a lot to write home about other than just sort of this distribution overnight, which we can also see in the 10s, right? There's just this pattern of distribution. Rates are moving a bit higher, so the price of these futures always move in inverse, so they're moving a bit lower. Euro consolidating a bit, but overall kind of a similar look with the bond futures. The Euro's been moving lower in the overnight session and sort of consolidating here in the US cash session. Take a look at NVIDIA here.
Oil futures reverse course with US and Brent turning positive after falling by $1 a barrel.
And NVIDIA just showing a little bit of support here at just above that point of control and now at VWAP. So trying to reverse out of this more bearish microstructure. We'll see. Right now, I'd look at this more as consolidation, potentially looking into an intraday reversal. SMCI I'd say this is more of a reversal on this one. It's actually playing out, looking a little bit more constructive, and we'll see how we get to 1100 and if we're able to make a push above this time, whereas last time we did not. Meta sort of consolidating here. The stock has had a rough day overall, but now seems to be stabilizing. Amazon, kind of a similar look as Meta. Bit of distribution in that first hour. Now we're stabilizing. You know, some of that first hour distribution in the real call heavy stocks probably has to do with this idea that, you get these supportive flows in the S&P from puts decaying, right? So market makers are going back in and buying back that ES exposure because the puts are losing value, so they don't need to hedge as much. Well, the other side of that is true with the really popular optionable stocks, right? If you have really heavy call skew going into OPEX, you're going to have distributive flows. You're going to have market makers selling shares because they bought those shares to hedge call exposure. And so that first hour, you're going to see a fair amount of that activity. And I think that's one of the things we've seen in some of these call heavy stocks today as we're in OPEX week. Saw a bit of that, in Microsoft as well. And Apple has not been as call heavy because it hasn't been much of a performer. So you saw the opposite in Apple as we started the day. In fact, I'm curious of the skew in Apple. So pardon me a moment while I take a quick look. Apple skew is still pretty bullish overall, though. So maybe that was some short covering today. Google really had a very strong bid off the open. This has been a laggard. It tested its moving average, closed 2 days below it, was finally able to pop back above it, sort of like a beach ball being held underwater. That pressure just unleashing a wave of buying in this stock. It's up easily $5 off of those prior lows that we saw last week. And then Tesla starting to catch a bid here at 177. There's a rather large resting bid there. So we have seen the large resting offers act as resistance, 183 specifically earlier today. Now we're seeing the large resting bid act as support. This is another reason why this heat map can be so useful on Bookmap, not just for futures, but for equities overall. Looking at the semiconductor ETF, we're just going to kind of look at the whole day in context here. Really just a seesaw overall, but starting to look a little more constructive. And then finally back to MicroStrategy, which is seeing a little bit of distribution after that pop. S&P cash down about 0.25%. NASDAQ cash down 0.3%. Just a little bit of a recovery here from the lows. SMCI calls getting a lot of attention again. Looking at the 1120s and the 1125s for this Friday, and total 328,000 in premium paid there. Also ASML, another semiconductor, the 1040 calls for April 19th, 160,000 in premium paid there. And the NVIDIA 875s, really targeting close to spot here, the expiring next Friday, 265,000 in premium paid. So one of the themes we talked about on Friday, and really last week as a whole, I think it was Thursday I was last on, so let me correct myself. One of the themes we talked about Thursday was the amount of aggressive semiconductor call buying across the board. We are seeing some of that continue into today. It's not quite as intense as it was on Thursday, but it's still pretty intense. Also seeing that 30-minute cumulative volume delta for the S&P start to move positive here. Really been positive over the last half hour and starting to build higher into that positivity.
White House estimates 2025 unemployment rate at 4% versus February rate of 3.9%, and estimates 3.8% for 2028 to 2034 period. The White House says GDP and unemployment forecasts include pro-growth effects of childcare and other Biden proposals to boost labor force participation. White House estimates real interest rate at 1.2% in fiscal year 2025, 1.3% average over fiscal year 2025 to 2034 period. The White House estimates U.S. real GDP growth at 1.8%.
Macro note, Biden unveiling budget for 2025.
2.2% in 2034, based on forecasts locked in November. White House budget proposal estimates 2025 deficit of $1.781 trillion versus $1.859 trillion in 2024, $1.694 trillion in 2023.
Okay, I'm just going to make a little joke here. The White House is making a budget forecast. The federal government hasn't had a budget since September of 2023. The fiscal year 2024 started October 1st, 2023. We have not had a budget. So it's kind of funny to go out and forecast for a budget when we can't seem to pass a budget. Now, in a lot of countries, if they can't pass a budget, the entire legislative apparatus, whether it's a parliament or something else, is just dissolved.
So the White House budget estimates
I don't know what's
cumulative
going on.
2025 to 2034 deficit of $16.297 trillion versus the latest CBO baseline deficit forecast of $20.016 trillion.
Saying I don't know what's going on where we don't have any accountability for our legislators in that same capacity, but it sure would help to motivate them if they would lose their job and their compensation if they couldn't pass a budget. I don't think
the White
we'd be
House
in the same
budget
situation.
estimates deficit at 6.1% of GDP in 2025 versus 6.6% in 2024, averages 4.6% over 2025 to 2034, estimates receipts at 18.7% of GDP in 2025 versus 16.5% in 2023, growing to 20.3% in 2034, and estimates debt held by public at 102.2% of GDP in 2025 versus 97.3% in 2023, growing to 105.6% in 2034.
So personally, I always take all these projections with a bit of a grain of salt because we really don't know what the interest rate outlook is going to be, or if any economic slowdown is going to encourage greater stimulus, or if we're going to have any kind of formal budget passed anytime soon. So, just take it for what it is, which is just a very small amount of data with no real basis in reality. We got block or square or whatever we want to call it. 65 calls for September 20th, 109,000 in premium trading on those, getting a little bit more excitement in the payment processor platform. And my apologies, 85 strike. Now, again, tomorrow we do have CPI coming in year over year. The consensus is 3.7% month over month, and this is for core, 3.7% core year over year. Headline, 3.1%. Core month over month, 0.3% consensus. Headline month over month, 0.4%.
Iceberg ESM for CME sell at 51.73 crossed 500.
And there's another alert telling us that there was a large amount of flow coming through, an unusually large distributive trade in ES. That iceberg on top of 803 was 803 contracts being passively sold into this tape. We did see some absorption. Another iceberg came in and bought shortly thereafter 458 contracts. So that's what those alerts mean. I set them up through Bookmap so it kind of draws my attention back when there's something interesting happening. because often is the case when you see that large flow, there can be some continuation too. So let's look around the market. There's the NASDAQ crossing below the point of control and VWAP, now just trading above it. Got the Russell, also kind of a similar distributive look, but just chop. Really, this Russell for the last 2 hours has just been chopsville. Gold trading just about $10 below 2,200 here. Crude continuing to build. Remember, this thing has been all over the map, right? So we're going to zoom out a little bit. You can see that. We had that big pull, and then from the open, we really started to see a bid higher in crude. So we got down to about 76.80. We filled that large resting bid, and it's just been moving the other way since, up about $1.40 from those lows. 2-year note contract, you know, starting to reverse a bit lower. Rates moving a bit higher on the short end, similar with the 10s. Euro got this pop, but now we're starting to see a bit more of a drop here as we get into lunch hour. And NVIDIA really showing some weakness. We talked about the breakdown in that trend microstructure, right? And it just kind of continues
So the
here.
ECB is leaning toward keeping 1% bank's minimum reserve level.
This 864 level on NVIDIA is going to be the line in the sand, right? If we do cross below it, sellers are more likely to show some deeper aggression in the stock. And we do have a very large resting bid down here at 850, which could provide support. SMCI kind of resembling the look in NVIDIA, not quite as weak yet, but it does tend to follow with a little bit of latency. So we'll see how that goes. Meta consolidating, not a whole lot to see here. Overall, just kind of chopping sideways over the last hour and a half. Amazon,
So the
pretty
European
similar
central
look.
bank officials are leaning against any immediate change in the amount of money lenders need to park with the institution interest-free, according to people with knowledge of the matter, removing for now the threat of a hit to banking profitability the industry has been fretting over.
So we're seeing the ECB kind of mirror the Fed, pushing against these Basel III higher reserve requirements for banks. So that's 2 major central banks in a row deferring on that because, you know, their constituency is largely the banks, and this would do them no favors, particularly some of the ones that are struggling more. So I could see why the timing for that change probably not ideal. Microsoft, relatively stronger versus some of the peers we just looked at here. Above the VWAP, rejected squarely at that point of control, just around 404, where there's a large resting offer. Apple coming up off of its lows as the rest of the market looks a little choppier. This one has been resilient. And Google, look at that. It took out the 139 resting offer, but it could not remain above. There was a lot of absorption there by sellers. And finally, Tesla. Tesla breaking above the 177.77 pivot level here and just sort of chopping around. This one's given us a couple head fakes today on its intraday trend. So, you know, probably one to just watch for now. And we'll go back to the S&P and we'll zoom in just a little bit more. ARM 150s for April 19th, 162,000 in premium on the call side. More excitement in semiconductors, a theme we've been tracking. And Freeport-McMoran, haven't seen a lot of resource stocks pop across the unusual options screen, but one just popped across now, FCX. 180,000 in premium for the 45 strike in January OPEX 2025. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ again. NASDAQ, it just has this weak look to it. It just keeps kind of slouching. And that relative weakness versus the S&P is one to keep an eye on because the NASDAQ does tend to lead in terms of momentum. So we are watching the NASDAQ closely here as it slips below VWAP. And we saw some of those NASDAQ stocks in that last go-around showing some weakness as well.
I'd take a GR.
That pull in the NASDAQ seems to be building a little bit more aggression from sellers. You can see those delta bubbles getting a little bit bigger. That's showing that there are sellers starting to really overwhelm buyers here. Don't see any real unusual levels of resting liquidity below in the NASDAQ, but that's not too unusual for it. It is a less liquid trading vehicle than the S&P, which is why it's higher vol, higher beta. Let's see if the S&P is catching down a little bit here. It's still above its respective VWAP. We do see some stops getting pushed out. You see that 61, that 64. Those are sell stops, just like on this pop higher.
GRYP, Golf Romeo Yankee Papa. You're seeing a spike in activity for GRYP.
Just like on that
I know
pop
that is
higher,
a micro cap GRYP.
You could see S&P had 308 contracts pushed out. These were shorts that were pushed out with forced buys on the stops. So, you know, knowing where the stops are happening, that can be kind of helpful as well, just to contextualize what's driving some of the price discovery. And again, just not a lot of conviction from either side. If you look at the way this market's trading and you kind of look at, you know, what we saw earlier, you would see generally larger delta bubbles here in Bookmap. So far,
No ticker
pretty
STI,
light.
Sandy Tango India. Sure seeing continued heavy activity, new highs for STI.
And, you know, during lunch hour, that tends to be the case. Folks step away from their desk for a bit. You know, algos kind of run the show for the next hour or two. And then things start to get more interesting later in the afternoon again. Yeah. Got some interesting flow in silver SLV options for next Friday. 102,000 in premium for the 22.5 strike. Silver is one we've been talking about for a little bit with the idea that it could start to catch up to gold. And I do still think that's going to be a bit of a theme. Silver is outperforming gold today. It is starting to show us some desire to catch up. Now, it is a dual use metal. It's not like gold where it's primarily used as a precious metal. Silver has a lot of industrial applications, and that demand has been somewhat lagging. But if we do start to see more demand in communications, electronics, military equipment, solar power, and otherwise, silver, which is the best conductor and used for a lot of key circuitry, could see more demand as well. I don't subscribe to the silver squeeze theories. I don't, because I've been trading silver and gold since 2005, 2006, and I can tell you how many of these theories have come and gone, and they're all based on a misunderstanding of how banks act as intermediaries for miners. So what do I mean? Well, if you're a silver miner or gold miner or copper miner, really any kind of producer of anything, you're often going to go through an intermediary to sell forward future production so you can raise cash in the present. In many situations, particularly one of high interest rates, that ends up being more attractive than taking out a revolving line of credit. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like banks taking short positions in silver, right? It looks like banks taking short positions in gold, because that's what it's going to look like on the commitment of traders and really all the other positioning information you can get. But on the other side of that, there's a miner that's producing and selling into that. So it's not really a short position as much as that miner saying, you know what? The price of gold at that June contract seems good enough to us. We're going to sell some of our gold production now to raise some cash so we can try to get as much out of it as we can, right? So we can pay our expenses, so we don't have to worry about raising debt or diluting shareholders. So the idea that there's this imminent silver squeeze because of this phantom huge short position at JP Morgan or Deutsche Bank or somewhere else, it's not realistic, because that short position is matched more often than not by miners selling forward future production. And so what does that really mean? It really means that if you want to be kind of grumpy about any participant in the precious metals market kind of putting their thumb on the scale, it's more often than not the miners. I know there's been spoofing and funny business and other stuff that's happened around the London fix, and I know we've seen, people get caught doing that, but the bigger driver of price discovery has really been the producers selling forward future production. And that's why there's not really this giant phantom short position in silver that's going to send it into the triple digits. If anything is going to do that for silver, it's going to be a big increase in the appreciation of it as a precious metal, as a hedge against uncertainty more than inflation, and then also its role as an industrial metal increasing, right? Those would be the two areas that really give silver a bid and a chance back to, to maybe the highs we saw in 2011 or higher. Because remember, silver, even though gold is at new all-time highs, silver is still well below its high even in 2011, which was, I think, around $48 an ounce. We do see a little more excitement here in the S&P as we're just navigating through lunch hour here. But again, not a lot of conviction on the tape, not a lot to see or to make of it. NASDAQ, again, the momentum leader, starting to show a little bit of signs of buyers coming back in. But this has been a very choppy trading day, and I zoom out for that context. As you can see, it's just been up and down and up and down, and we're kind of coiling up, making smaller lows and smaller highs, probably coiling up for a bigger move here in the later afternoon, one direction or the other. Wow, someone really just wants to buy all the MicroStrategy calls they possibly can. 2.415 million paid for the 1800 strike for June 21st OPEX. Absolutely incredible amount of call buying in that thing. This is also a highly shorted stock. So this idea of it kind of being a squeeze candidate, quite realistic. 20% of the float shorted. The float is only 15 million shares. So we can see why it wouldn't be particularly hard to drive this thing much, much higher. 2 million shares have already traded today with an average volume of 1.73 million a day. And just so folks know, we are running a sale on the SPX options visualizer right now. It is 50% off. The usual price is $60 a month, $600 a year. Right now we're doing $30 a month, $300 a year, and a $1,200 lifetime option. The lifetime option will be going away soon, and the prices will be going back to $60 a month after the sale ends. So take advantage, as we will be ending this sale as we start to move into spring.
According to France Info Radio, refinery fire underway at the Esso ExxonMobil plant in Port Jerome.
And we do see some building interest in Apple here. The Apple May 17th 190s, 105,000 in premium paid.
So we have posted an article from Wall Street Journal's Tim Arrayos on the White House forecast somewhat higher interest rates.
Sorry, folks, give me a second. I'm just taking a screenshot of what's on screen here. All right, we'll zoom back in. If you're interested in that SPX options visualizer, I just tweeted about it, so it'd be the first tweet on my feed, so you can get directly linked in. You can also check out more about it at traderade.com/SPX. We do have that 50% off sale going on, probably for just about another week. And then that lifetime option and the 50% discount will go away, and we'll go back to the normal pricing of $60 a month, $600 a year, and no lifetime option. This is just part of the launch. Try to, get people in that come in early. But we will be going back to that higher level of pricing after the sale ends. So I want to thank everyone for watching the stream. I'm going to hop off. The stream was brought to you by Traderade, where we help you sharpen your trading edge. Check us out at traderade.com. You can sign up for a monthly or yearly plan that includes access to our Discord, this stream, and a whole lot more, including alerts from our bots and on trading opportunities, real-time news headlines, both Squawk and on text, and of course, our analysis of trading opportunities from our team. You can join us by visiting traderade.com, and at checkout, you can use the code Mayhem20 for 20% off. If you're interested in longer-term investment opportunities, check out MacroVisor, where momentum and macro equal opportunity. And look out for Aisha. She'll be on Fox Business today, just after 2 p.m. on the Making Money with Charles Payne show. So thank you, everyone. Again, if you want Bookmap, if you like what you see on screen, check out traderade.com/bookmap. You can get up to 40% off by checking out the specials there. If you like the advanced SPX options visualizer, visit traderade.com/SPX or check out the latest tweet on my feed. And of course, I will be back soon, tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp, for another stream. And I'll probably come on a little early so we can talk CPI. So maybe look for me closer to just around 8:25, 8:30, so we can start talking about inflation and the market reaction to that print. So again, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you all soon.